Well, we're the only one that actually has the enshrined First Amendment. And most people never thought of it. Do you think that a lot of Americans are just woefully unaware of that? And is that what's not only inspired you, but like Secretary Rubio's speech there in Munich?
You know, I think Secretary Rubio's speech in Munich, it was incredibly uplifting and it was incredibly well received because it focused on the shared heritage that we had with, what we called the free world during the Cold War. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to finally be on.
Well, we could just blame big tech. They heard your hate speech and they said we don't want this dame on air. So did you have to restart your phone? Is that what happened? Is it Tim Cook's fault?
Something like that. We tested it, but in any case, it's working now. It's really funny. A lot of the speech that I saw, the clips that you played, even the barbarian rapist hordes things, those aren't even originally my words. I can't take credit or blame for them. I'm quoting speech that European governments have tried to ban, and in some cases have tried to punish American companies for allowing. So we're having these conversations now because our countries have always had different approaches to this, but we are diverging. I think some of these countries are becoming a little more censorious as the internet challenges what we're all willing to allow. And of course, the internet is transnational, so these have become diplomatic conversations too, which is how they enter my purview. Yeah,
well, I was going to actually ask where did the necessity come from to do that? Because I was raised in Canada, and I mean, we actually rented a booth at the Texas DNC and did it change my mind, and we had to create a whole fake foundation, the Open Minds Foundation for the World. And I just said, America's the greatest country ever, changed my mind. And it didn't need to go any further. I said, well, we're the only one that actually has the enshrined First Amendment. And most people never thought of it. They go, yeah, they do. I go, no, every single country you've listed, people have been jailed for speech. Do you think that a lot of Americans are just woefully unaware of that? And is that what's not only inspired you, but like Secretary Rubio's speech there in Munich?
I think Secretary Rubio's speech in Munich, it was incredibly uplifting and it was incredibly well received because it focused on the shared heritage that we had with, what we called the free world during the Cold War. And I've had a couple of interactions with European diplomats where, I knew Charlie Kirk. I was one of his lawyers. And after Charlie Kirk died, I saw a couple of people wearing a T-shirt that I also owned. And that T-shirt said, "Je suis Charlie." I am Charlie. And we bought that T-shirt 10 years ago when Charlie Hebdo, which is a leftist French magazine with politics I don't agree with at all, they were attacked by Islamists for blaspheming Muhammad in a cartoon. They were murdered. And a bunch of Europeans stood up then for the freedom to say offensive, satirical, racist or Islamophobic things, edgy speech, unpopular speech that a lot of Americans would even call inflammatory, but we would be proud that our First Amendment allows. And I think that moment 10 years ago shows that even if America and Europe are a bit different, like I think a lot of countries might view our First Amendment the way they view our Second Amendment, as this radical commitment that these tyrannophobic settlers on the American frontier made that the rest of the world thinks is impractical. There's a moment where, when push comes to shove, when people are murdered for cartoons, that the West stood together. And I think that is the spirit that Secretary Rubio was channeling in that speech and that he received a standing ovation for.
Well, I was going to ask you, how have the people of Europe, in your estimation, not the government, because we know that they haven't received it super well, how have the people, though, received it? And do you think there's a divide?
I receive like hundreds or thousands of messages every day that say essentially, "Thank you for sticking up for Europeans. Thank you for sticking up for Brits." I receive angry messages too, of course, but I think if you look at polls in Europe, there's clearly a divide. This is an issue with populist appeal, and it's no surprise that.
Do you mean polls? When you say polls, do you mean like data, or do you mean like the Polacks?
Actually, that's extremely funny because I had a wonderful trip to Poland and I loved the Poles that I met. So the Poles in Europe are all great.
Yeah.
The data polls are great too, though. And I think one source of anxiety among some institutions and some elites has been that right-wing populist parties are rising in the polls. And there's this accusation, especially in the left-wing press, that I must be trying to, do regime change in Europe and seed these parties like AfD or Nigel Farage or National Rally or Marine Le Pen. And that's not true. America, we don't generally. Our administration doesn't generally do that. But what I have done is I've offered support a bit of financial support and just rhetorical support to causes that channel our focus on Western civilization, on the spirit of liberty and creation that Secretary Rubio praised in those remarks, and on the freedoms that define us as we approach our 250th birthday.
Well, I know that you talked about that, about helping to financially support some efforts. I wanted to ask you about that, and I wanted to ask you, is that kind of an answer? Because some people will be horrified, right? Like you said, they'll go, that's regime change. I don't really remember the last time we did regime change in places like Europe or France. But when we talk about financial support, Reporters Without Borders, RSF, we talked about them yesterday. They're funded by the UN, by the French government, by the Soros Open Societies Foundation, the National Endowment for Democracy. It's been going on for a long time. Is this the first time, because I don't know the answer to this, where there's a counterbalance, some kind of funding directly going towards supporting freedom of speech efforts?
So it is definitely not the first time that the United States has funded civil society organizations abroad. I think we may even have funded Reporters Without Borders at some point. Certainly the National Endowment for Democracy, which has gotten money from us, has funded them. Certainly the EU also has funded RSF. But we have funded historically, and especially the Biden administration funded organizations that agitated for more censorship of speech online. So my department, and this is consistent across the administration in the wake of DOJ and our focus on efficiency and eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse, we're spending less money than our predecessors did, but we are spending it on things that advance American interests and values. And it should come as no surprise that free expression is one of those.
Right. Yeah, I wanted to be clear in my question. I know that we funded those, but now knowing what that actually supports, I mean, their press freedom index, they actually weigh, is it left? And that's actually a net positive. That's where they go. They must be more free if they're left leaning. And this goes beyond, to people just, whether people are being edgy or trolling on social media. And I'm sure you've seen some of the the silly horseshit that we do on this show. But we also provide our references very publicly. You put out a recent report. This goes deeper on Chinese influence over groups like Code Pink, who kind of all but disappeared when I grew up. Code Pink was everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing those baggy Gildan T-shirts. What are the ties and what is, for example, China's interest in some of these groups?
So this is a great question. And my part of the State Department, part of our job is to monitor and combat foreign propaganda and influence operations. And I think a lot of Americans, when they hear language like that, they feel distrustful because they think of the Russiagate smears against President Trump.
Right.
For a long time, when we heard about disinformation or misinformation online, it's just a way of calling President Trump and anyone who supports him a Russian bot, even when that was starkly untrue. And so I'm required to report to Congress on the sources of this foreign influence. And what my report says is it says, sure, Russia and other foreign powers engage in some of this activity, but so does China. And in fact, China, we have documented ties. China funneling tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into organizations that are explicitly leftist, like Code Pink, like the People's Forum, like this, in a related web of socialist and progressive and intersectional leftist organizations that do things like protest the removal of Maduro, pro-Maduro protests, pro-Hamas protests, and anti-ICE protests as well.
Right. And do you have, and this is just a genuine fishing question, because we've noticed this has infiltrated the right a little bit online with social activism. You just listed some anti-Maduro removal, some anti-ICE sentiment, pro-Hamas. Have you guys seen, or have you been able to track, or do you have a suspicion that maybe some funds are exchanging hands where it's kind of making its way to the right to veer them towards that?
I certainly, in the past, foreign adversaries have funded organizations across the political spectrum. I, sitting here, don't have evidence of China doing that, but to the extent that I would, I'd obviously collate and report that data. I do think what's true is that there are elements of the right that have converged on this kind of third worldist mentality, where anything anti-American is correct. So you'd support Maduro, you'd support Hamas, and I think that is a mentality kind of found in the fever swamps of the internet. I have not encountered it among conservatives that I know in the administration or conservatives that I've met on the street, but I've seen expos to that effect.
Yeah, well, we also saw that, for example, saw a bunch of conservative influencers saying, we need to keep Coca-Cola on Snap. And I'm going, whoa, what happened here? Yeah. And then you see these same people saying, Donald Trump needs to be impeached for the Iranian, the uranium refinement strike, which to me is still a miracle in military strategy. And I go, that doesn't seem very conservative. So, like I said, it was just a question. Going back to the polls, I think they can be called Polacks because they have a good sense of humor about themselves. But we love the polls. Have you noticed a difference? You mentioned them, how great they are. For example, Poland, Hungary, and other people more across Western Europe. Is there a really strong divergence?
I don't know how strong or stark it always is, but there's certainly a gradation. And I think it's obvious that people who lived under communism are more opposed and more deeply informed about the signs of the return of a kind of smothering, left-leaning, totalizing form of social control that wants to surveil all of your communications and tell you what ideas are allowed. And when I was in Poland, I received a private, personalized tour of the Warsaw Uprising Museum, which was one of the most moving experiences I've had in this role. So the Warsaw Uprising occurred after Poland was split and occupied half by Hitler, half by Stalin. And both Hitler and Stalin were essentially trying to kill off anyone in Poland who could resist them. So Stalin massacred about 22,000 people in a town called Katyn. Hitler banned Polacks from receiving education beyond elementary school because he wanted them to be slaves. He wanted them to be degraded. Polish priests were harassed. You were not allowed to be a professional. So the Poles resisted. I mean, they established like underground, this is what people who are actually oppressed do. They didn't whine and and just like sit back. They were literally administering like underground university education, administering an underground bar exam to create their own lawyers. They had an underground army, they had an exiled government. The Polish resistance was so courageous, they were literally sneaking into Auschwitz to expose Nazi crimes.
Yeah, and then
these people, yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, continue. I was gonna say, that's why I think now they're like, we don't want that to happen again.
We don't want that. Yeah, we don't want that to happen again, obviously. And then Hitler and Stalin, their alliance eventually breaks up, right? So Stalin's advancing on the Eastern Front, and the Poles, that Stalin's technically an ally, so they should be relieved to be liberated. But they watch as Stalin advances. Cities don't really get liberated; they get kind of crushed by communism, and so the Poles rise up, facing near certain death and almost impossible odds, and they stitch together forbidden Polish flags out of scraps of fabric that they've kept. And they want the city to be Polish when it is freed, so that it is not just absorbed by Stalinism, so that it has its identity is not obliterated. And Stalin decides, and this is what Stalin says, that the Polish resistance, these people who've been sneaking into Auschwitz to expose crimes, these people are bourgeois, so they deserve to die.
Right.
So Stalin pauses the army outside the city and lets Hitler kill tens to hundreds of thousands of Poles. There are 900,000 people in Warsaw when that uprising begins. There are 1,000 left by the time Hitler gets finished, and Stalin is completely complicit in it. And then Hitler does a controlled demolition of the city. All the churches, all the palaces are intentionally dynamited, even as armies are closing in, even as World War II is about to end. Demolishing the last shreds of Polish pride, Polish identity are what's important to Hitler. And I think meeting Poles who then came back and reconstructed their city from photographs and then lived through decades of Soviet totalitarianism before they were finally freed, it's no wonder that these people are grateful for freedom. And it was an honor to meet them.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing a lot. You look at Cuban Americans. That's why it's the most consistent conservative voting bloc. People who come directly from communism, who have experienced it, they have a different appreciation. I think that kind of goes to the central problem. I was raised in Canada. It's a silly place with mostly silly people, Alberta notwithstanding. My question is always, are there enough people in Europe? Because I will say with Canada, outside of Alberta, there are conquered people. And by conquered people, I mean people who have traded, they've traded all their freedoms for safety, and they've done so, in many cases, traded it for legalized marijuana, and they've done so very happily. They will, you have too many Canadians who are happy that truckers had their bank account frozen. I don't know that there can be a populist movement of people fighting for free speech in Canada across the whole country because there aren't enough people. Do you think we're at that tipping point in Europe? Do you think it's a majority? And do you think that what you're doing could have an impact to push it toward a majority? Because I think that Canada outside of Alberta perhaps is a lost cause.
I think when you interact with the polls, both in Poland and the data showing public opinion, you see signs of optimism. When I interact with people on the European streets, I feel signs of optimism. And, making positive change here doesn't have to mean electing insurgent parties. We're really focused on, I'm focused on public diplomacy, public opinion, public understanding. And I think America's birthday is a great sort of convening opportunity for this, because everyone's eager to celebrate that with us. And when we celebrate our founding, we talk about, here is what has made our country great. Here is why, you know, genuine refugees from horrors like World War II have flocked to our shores and flourished and prospered, because you're allowed to say what you think is true. You are allowed to you can start a business, you can, build a fortune, you can provide for a family in ways that you really can't in a lot of places. So I'm hopeful about Europe, and I think that tone of hope and optimism about our transatlantic alliance really comports with both the Secretary's remarks at Munich and the reception he received, which was overwhelmingly positive.
Well, that's heartening to hear. I wanted to ask you, too, you've mentioned that Europe is also pushing censorship, sort of a Trojan horse dressed as child protection. I see that here sometimes in the States with Democrats, and I was like, wait, hold on a second, aren't you guys a drag queen story hour? We're going to push this under the guise of protection of children. Do you have specific examples of this? Because I know that a lot of conservatives are going, well, yeah, you should have to have age verification for pornography, for example, or OnlyFans. That's sensible, because we don't want to turn our nation into a nation of prostitutes for an extra buck. But I also know that that can be used against people to sort of subvert it. Do you have specific examples of them sort of dressing something up as child protection?
Sure. I mean, child protection is a goal that America and Europe shares, and the First Lady has been very active, and I've worked with her on this issue as well. But the problem is it depends on how you do the child protection, and I do see proposals for child protection that could be easily Trojan horses for censorship. So, for example, under the UK Online Safety Act, there's a whole bunch of content that has to be gated for people who are under a certain age. But when you impose that default gating obligation on a website like X or like Instagram, or like, if you had a website, any website, the problem is if I just navigate to your website, you know nothing about me. So a law that requires you, if the rule is that you have to block the content unless the person's an adult, then really if you take that beyond pornography, it gets very censorious very fast.
Right.
There was an example of a member of parliament in Britain called Katie Lamb, who gave a speech on the floor of British Parliament about the grooming gang scandal. And that was not a pornographic speech. It was a speech reciting matter-of-fact crime statistics, but that was censored by default on social media because it contained upsetting content, and we don't know for sure that everyone is an adult. So the net effect was, if you were British, you weren't allowed to watch a very important speech in Parliament about one of the greatest scandals, I think, of your lifetime, that you should be informed about, that you should be voting about. And all that means is that when we do child protection, it doesn't mean we don't care a lot about it. It just means that we try to verify people in a way that is frictionless, that is easy, that helps adults stay anonymous so that they're not chilled from engaging in speech that the government might come after them for, which is another concern with, forcing people to identify themselves constantly on every website. And my office is actively investing in and exploring solutions for that. There are ways to identify children and identify adults that don't require you to upload your driver's license every time you run a Google search, which is that I've seen and disagree with.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that's also a big failure of libertarianism, because people go like, it's the parents' job. It's like, well, or we could look at an alternative world where if pornography was cleaned up from X, for example, hardcore pornography and mainstream trends, then everyone would be able to use that site, because it's not a site that can't be used by children. I give you an example. We play a game here on the show called Age Restricted or Not on YouTube. And we will roll a clip, for example, of a pastor speaking. He could be talking about gender roles in church or something, traditional that may offend some people. That's age restricted. And then we'll play a clip of or dildo. And this is, I don't say this week, this is actually a game where a gay man lies down on a table and there's a sheet that hides, and the man inserts something in his butt and he has to guess if it's a or a dildo. By the way, the answer is always they don't pass up the opportunity. So that was not age restricted on YouTube. And so I just say that as an example where they can go, oh, child protection, and it's applied selectively. For example, we were removed when we cited the CDC's own statistics on flu deaths being more significant than COVID deaths in infant. This is a medical fact. That was removed because they said, we don't want anyone to not take COVID seriously. Well, we're not. We're saying that people need to take the flu seriously with their kids. So I think libertarians sometimes go freedom, and don't understand that actually there's a reason that, for example, you need to be of age to engage in certain activities. And we used to have that if you went to a store to buy a pack of cigarettes. So I know it's complicated online, but I do hope that the messaging can also clarify that, because I see some people who are very reticent.
Yeah, I think our messaging, we are adamant that child protection is a legitimate and an important priority, and we want to achieve it in ways that actually and fairly protect children without having that regulation or that policy imperative, which serves a great post-social goal, being weaponized to censor content from particular viewpoints or being weaponized to just force everyone to identify themselves and be surveilled at all times.
Yes.
And I think, your focus on pornography and other highly obscene content is instructive, because even under the American First Amendment, obscenity has never been protected. And when we see these laws invoked or we see laws proposed that would just block any content that's upsetting, including news, I think that's an area where probably we should be more cautious. I think it's much safer to focus child protection on obscene content, perhaps extremely violent content. And I also think there's space here for the industry to do what the movie industry did with its voluntary ratings system. And I think we're seeing green shoots of that. We're seeing signs of that. Like Meta now has mandatory teen accounts. If you're under the age of 18, you have to have this restricted account that is unable to access all this other stuff. Both Apple and Android, you can set up a phone for your child that has, a bunch of protections built into it. And I think part of my job is convening these companies and educating parents about these solutions and educating countries about them. Because I think one thing that libertarians tend to be right about is you should try enforcing the laws you have, and you should try employing the controls you have before you just make a whole bunch of new laws. If we enforced, when I used to be a lawyer for the NRA, and I remember one of our favorite stats was if you enforced existing gun laws, you would significantly cut down all of these shootings in places like Chicago, but you don't enforce them. You just enact new ones because there's a political taste for them. And you end up with this tangle of laws that don't really achieve any of your policy objectives, but do burden normal law-abiding people in ways that some of the legislators who voted for those laws never intended.
Well, the good news is there's a solution for that. Just blame all the gun violence in Chicago on a gun show in Indiana, and problem solved. Lane the Brain, actually, my lead producer, he's a big fan of yours. He's going to be bashful, but he had some questions that he wanted to ask you. And I know you're busy because we had the technical difficulties. I appreciate it.
I have to go in a bit, but I'm happy to answer.
Okay, Lane, you get one question. Make it count.
Yeah, so I know we talked about
you and
Poland.
Your Henley.
Well, first of all, the Warsaw Uprising Museum is awesome. I was there last year. If anybody has the opportunity to go, that's the most miraculous city I've ever seen from what they rebuilt. But I wanted to touch on China real quick, because I'm sure you know this as well as anybody, that there's no aspect of American digital life that the Chinese propagandists aren't just flooding with every day. And there's a new trend right now that's called a very Chinese time in my life. And the media outlets are describing that as a victory of Chinese soft power. Before it was Xiaohongshu, before that it was TikTok. It's always something else, even to the degree that their state officials are spreading the message in America. And they can do that because of our inherently liberal system. However, you look at the Chinese system, which is inherently illiberal, it prevents Americans from interacting with the Chinese public on a day-to-day basis. So my question would be, is there anything, or what is the State Department doing to kind of fight that asymmetric battle to actually show the Chinese people, hey, America's not what you're being fed from China Daily or from Xinhua News. There's a lot more to this. I know it's hard because of the great firewall they have up, but what's that battle like for the State Department?
Okay, that was a good question.
So it's a really interesting question. And America has always invested in solutions that help people in repressive regimes get online. And, our degree of investment and focus depends upon a lot of strategic and tactical factors at different points in time. But that's always been a priority for us. It will remain one for us. And there are other forms of soft power that we can deploy, like exchange programs, like film screenings. Free people choose America. And not everyone in China is free, but I think when you interact with people online, and especially as AI degrades the translation barrier, I think a lot of these kids, they interact with our content and they interact with it really favorably. And I think throughout the year, as we approach 250 and we roll out more programs, I'll have more to say on this front. One more thing I do want to say on Warsaw, by the way, not to spend all my time on Warsaw.
No, I understand. It's a great place.
Yeah. It's a great place, and I wanted to say, after the Soviets decided that the bourgeois Poles deserved to be murdered by Hitler, the two countries that disagreed were America and Britain. And we dropped the only aid to those people that they received. And if you stand in that museum, there's an American bomber that was shot down by Hitler, that was reconstructed by Poles in that museum with help from our Department of War. And that's the kind of collaboration that seeing it and touching it really makes this job one of the greatest gifts anybody could get. And I look forward to sharing more with perhaps your audience and with global audiences throughout the year as we highlight more examples of international relations like this, which is, I think, is really America at its best and the transatlantic relationship at its best.
Absolutely. And I know that you have to go. So I think in summary, the Polish, there's some tough SOBs. The Chinese, watch out. Miss Sarah Rogers, thank you so much for taking the time. We'll talk with you soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Be well. You don't get a question, Jared.
Nah, I'm fine. I'm good. I was just enjoying hearing that conversation. I really just want to touch back. I really hope they are going to be employing some really good strategies, if they aren't already, on curbing Chinese influence in social media on us and exposing us to, I don't know if it's Starlink being airdropped.
You can't curb stomp all the Chinese.
No, I didn't say curb stomp.
Tell that to Edward
There's
Norton.
not enough curbs for stomping. No, but you see it every single day on X. You see it on all social media platforms. Like there is a strategy being employed right now from China to influence us here in the United States. And it's not like, hey, China good. It's more division in the United States, or some fight potentially over a Chinese aspect of business that they want you to see favorably, or a policy that they want to kind of curb. But you see this more than I do, and
I see it a lot.
Pervasive even on my feed.
Well, it's very soft. Like when you say soft power, it's interacting with the publics of these countries, and the goal being to, I think, when China goes against Taiwan and just hits the Philippines or whatever, the public will look at it and say, well, they're the same people that they have pets like us, and they have
they
good
eat
food
'em.
in their schools. But why do we want to go to war with them? They're good people. That's the goal. And so when you see things like, it's not the Lunar New Year, it's actually the Chinese New Year. Well, that actually means something. There's a reason that they're pushing these messages, because they stack up, and it's a little more nefarious than you'd take it first.
Yeah, and that's why we hate people like Jackson Hinkle as well, because he carries the water for a lot of these regimes. But not only that, but Lane, the Cold War, basically the way we won in summary, is we caused the Russians to have to spend so much money on their economy that it essentially collapsed to keep up with us in the arms race. That was a big proponent, or a big kind of factor in the win. China can do the same thing to us by just causing division and pushing narratives out that get us to spend more time, more energy, more resources on things either internally or externally that we don't need to spend time or money on, right? Losing our focus. Instead of focusing on China, like pivoting to other parts of the world and completely ignoring China. They would love nothing more than that to happen.
Well, so she said about Code Pink.
Yeah, exactly.
It's to instill division. They don't want to invade the United States. That's not something they have plans to do.
They win other ways.
But they could destroy us through division.
I have a bit of a different. I agree with what you just said. I think it buys China time.
Yeah.
I think if you look at it, I think that China has some serious where they wouldn't be able to do what we did, for example, with Russia. Just not only their population problem, not only the economic collapse that they'll be facing. Also, when we talk about debt, I think we've built up China, into this
crazy
Leviathan that it really isn't. But they certainly can sow division and buy themselves time.
Yeah, that's why they're trying to use these other methods, I think, so that they understand that there is a clock. And they understand that they can't do to us what we did to Russia, not directly at least. Right. So they're doing other things.
There's real stories of what China looks like today on the internet if you know where to look and if you speak Chinese.
Yeah.
The problem is most Americans just don't have the access or time to actually see that.
Look, an upside down rail train.
That's
cool. Why can't we have that?
Not the giant sinkhole that swallows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I thought I was on the first floor and I'm on the 40th. Wow.
Well, what's so funny too is I was actually recently at a place. Well, it's a sauna place, and there was a guy there talking, and he was Russian. He was talking about how he went to Korea on vacation. He was talking about how he was bringing back these keychains that I guess are they're really popular in Korea. It's all about keychains. He was saying he can buy them there and sell them for 8 times the price here.
Wow.
But he said, it was my favorite vacation. I went back because I loved it. Just the most beautiful, this unique culture. And I said, well, what do you mean by that culture? The Korean culture. And I said, well, why do you think that is? So you mean like a distinct culture? I said, yeah. Should we be able to have that in the United States? I said, did you ask him about the Japanese or the Chinese? Did you ask him about the Chinese? And he was like, well, and another guy goes, oh yeah, another guy had spent time in Japan specifically. And he was like, the way they talk about the Chinese and the Koreans. And the guy, it didn't dawn on him going, so it's cool for every country to have a culture, but what about the United States? Are we allowed to do the same thing that Korea does? Well, it's different here. Well, why?
Yeah.
Why is it different? And he just didn't have an answer. And this is something that sounds really cool in social circles with liberals, like this beautiful, I went and it was this beautiful culture. Great.
Why?
Why? And why not, as far as the United States being able to do the same thing?
Well,
and Asia is definitely pretty firm on that. A lot of these Asian countries, they're not bound by the same constraints.
Japan just recently passed laws against Muslims, essentially.
Well, they got to 3%.
I would hesitate to give too much credence to that.
Is it fake?
It's not entirely what they're saying.
It's immigrants in general. They got to 3%. Like,
they were,
oh no, nation crumble.
No, so I'll
they just don't allow special protections that Muslims are requesting a lot of the time.
Right.
They just have to follow the same rules.
Okay, I saw posts that said something different than that. So, but again, sometimes you don't know what you're really looking at. But it was more of like they weren't allowing new mosque construction. Or
that's very possible.
Yeah. See, but that just one thing. I won't even go through the rest of the list. One thing, new mosque construction. Okay, done. No more mosques. In the United States, people will be like, but we have the freedom to practice religion however we want. Japan sees the threat.
Yeah.
It goes, listen, I understand. We can keep freedom. Freedom is a great thing. You can practice your religion. We're just not building mosques.
Right.
Do it at home if you want to. We're not doing this.
Well, even in China, if you're a Muslim, and not saying that we should go the direction of China, but it does tell you that they understand the political threat that Islam faces. Where if you're a Muslim shopkeeper, you sell beer and cigarettes.
Yeah.
You're not allowed. You
There's
don't
no
have a religious
halal
exemption.
anything. Yeah.
Why? Because we're not going to allow that, because then people will cease to be Chinese.
Yeah.
And you look at that, you go, okay, well, that's one thing. If communist China does it, maybe go a different direction, but that means they recognize. They treat it the same way they treat the threat of Americanism in China.
The Chinese are kind of, in my mind, like they're like the red pill guys. They've accurately diagnosed a problem. Their solutions to the problem, I think, are wrong.
All of them.
Right? But the problem is still real. Like, we still have to, and you've got people in the United States, come on, we're pivoting back to Islam being a problem. It's like it never stopped being a problem. You just were
Did you see
busy.
it's not Reform, Restore. Rupert Lowe's new party in the UK that he launched to the right of Nigel Farage, because he thought, a lot of people think Nigel's too soft right now, including our friend Carl Benjamin. But I believe it was their party posted.
I think he probably is, Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
I think he's made some missteps for sure. Yeah.
He's really soft on legal immigrants, which are all the asylum seekers. But there was a post, I believe, from that party that made the statement, a British passport does not make you British.
Right.
And people melted down over that.
yeah.
But it's so inherently true if you think about it.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. I mean, that's one of those things where I think, I'm hoping that we see a rebellion. What was it with, was it the UK, the Amelia meme that was being used?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The girl with the knives?
Yeah, where then they kind of reversed it, and that sort of woke some people up. Yeah, you guys saw that? Yeah.
It's kind of like the Britney Spears thing, but just actually for better reason.
Well, no, I don't think it was the girl.
It's the game from the game.
Yeah, it's the game.
Oh.
Nick has a whole thing built if we ever want to get into it.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay.
But no, it really is interesting, and people do need to be aware of the soft threat. And hopefully she'll come back and we have some more answers on China, because the Chinese, not fans.
I know Trump's about to meet with Xi, so I can understand why there was
a little hesitation.
On that. Yeah, I was hoping for more, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it's possible.
All right. Well, thank you, Lane the Brain. We appreciate it. Good question. You made it count. All right. We'll grant you that one. Fat vagina is exactly what I would say if I wasn't here on YouTube. So go and subscribe on Rumble. Same channel where free speech is actually alive and well. Or you can stay here and the